They say you can choose your friends, but you can't choose your neighbors. I think I might hold the world record for the worst neighbor on the planet, but not for the reasons you'd think. This story isn't about loud parties or overgrown lawns. It's about a 150-year-old oak tree and a woman who thought she could bend the laws of nature and gravity to her will. She didn't just lose, she lost spectacularly. In a single dramatic moment, that tree, which she spent months trying to destroy, put a permanent hole in her roof, and an even bigger one in her ego. It was a beautiful, righteous kind of irony. I'm a systems engineer by trade. I see the world as a complex series of inputs and outputs, cause and effect. So when this whole mess started, I didn't see a neighborly dispute. I saw a broken process, a system with a critical flaw. My antagonist, let's call her Karen, was the HOA president. She wore her authority like a cheap suit, a beige one, of course. She was a walking, talking embodiment of petty bureaucracy. For years, I'd been the quiet guy up the hill, the one nobody ever saw. I kept my yard immaculate, my house pristine. I paid my dues on time. I was a ghost. Then one day, a beige envelope appeared in my mailbox, its crisp, laminated texture a harbinger of the coming storm. Now, before we get into the details of how I methodically dismantled her entire operation, let me ask you something. I've heard wild stories from people all over the world. So, where are you watching this story unfold from? Drop a comment and let me know. Back to the letter. It was a formal complaint about my ancient oak, a truly magnificent tree, a fixture on my property since before this entire subdivision was even a twinkle in a developer's eye. The notice cited aesthetic and safety concerns, vague legal jargon that basically meant, I don't like it. I read it twice, my mind already running diagnostics on their flimsy reasoning. They thought they were dealing with a simple homeowner. They had no idea they were dealing with an engineer and an accountant and a man who was about to turn their little suburban kingdom into a legal war zone. The first move had been made. The game was on. The laminated notice was just the opening act. The main event arrived on a Tuesday morning in the form of Karen herself, standing at the edge of my property line. She was dressed in the uniform of suburban tyranny, a beige cardigan, sensible slacks, and a smug expression that suggested she'd already won. Her posture was all entitlement, hands on her hips, her gaze fixed on the base of my oak. You got my letter, she stated, not asked. Her voice was thin and sharp, like a filing nail. Yes, I did, I replied, my voice a quiet contrast to her emotional register. I'm still trying to understand the legal basis for the complaint. According to the city's municipal code, this tree is designated a heritage landmark, and the root system is well within my property lines. I spoke in facts, in data points, in the language of objectivity. It was a language she didn't seem to understand. She scoffed, a theatrical sound that was meant to convey utter derision. The roots are threatening my foundation, she declared, pointing a perfectly manicured finger at a perfectly sound section of her lawn. I've had engineers come look at it. The lie was so casual, so effortless, it was almost impressive. My professional instincts kicked in. Could you provide their report and credentials? I'd be happy to cross-reference their findings with my own. I have the original land survey from 1978 and a recent topographical analysis. The mention of actual documents, of data, seemed to short-circuit her. Her smug expression began to waver, replaced by a flicker of irritation. That's not necessary, she snapped. This is a matter for the HOA, not some amateur survey. I offered a small, polite smile. I assure you, my analysis is anything but amateur. And if it's an HOA matter, I'd like to see the specific bylaw I'm in violation of. I watched the mask of her authority slip, revealing the panicked bully beneath. She was used to people cowering at her demands, not countering them with facts and clauses. My calm, factual answers were just more fuel for her fire. She huffed, spun on her heel, and marched back to her beige house. The first salvo had been fired. She thought she was winning a shouting match. I knew I was just collecting data. The day after my impromptu sidewalk debate with Karen, a new beige envelope appeared in my mailbox. This one was different. It wasn't just a laminated sheet. It was an official letter, complete with the HOA's embossed seal. The subject line read, "Final Notice, Non-Compliance Regarding Property Ordinance," and it demanded the immediate removal of my oak tree. The document cited vague aesthetic and safety concerns again, but this time it was signed by the entire HOA board and threatened escalating fines if I didn't comply within 30 days. It was a formal declaration of war, delivered with all the pomp and circumstance of a small-town bureaucracy. I didn't feel anger. Instead, a cold, professional curiosity settled over me. As a forensic accountant, my job is to find the story hidden within the data, to trace the flow of money and expose the cracks in a system. I see the world in numbers and rules, and this wasn't a problem to be solved with emotion. It was a problem to be solved with a methodical investigation. I pulled out my laptop and began my work. My first step was not to draft an angry reply, but to dive deep into the HOA's bylaws. I found a digital copy in a dusty corner of their website and started to read, line by line, clause by clause. I was looking for the tiny legal chinks in their armor, the weak spots in their argument. I cross-referenced their claims with local ordinances and state property laws. The HOA's document, with its vague pronouncements, was a flimsy house of cards. They were relying on my ignorance, on the assumption that I would simply capitulate. They didn't know I wasn't fighting their battle. I was fighting my own. I wasn't looking for a compromise. I was looking for their mistake. And as I started to build my case, I realized they had already made it. Some fights you have to pick, but the smart ones, the ones that really matter, are the ones you back into. After receiving the second beige envelope, the one with all the official-looking seals and empty threats, I knew I needed to change my perspective. I needed to see this not just as a legal battle, but as a long game. For that, I needed a different kind of counsel. Not the kind you find in a law firm, but the kind that comes from decades of quiet observation. My target was Mr. Henderson, a man who had lived in this neighborhood since it was nothing but a series of dirt paths. He was retired, a lawyer who had seen it all. I found him on his porch, a worn-out copy of a newspaper in his lap. I laid out my predicament, the letters, Karen's flimsy accusations, and my own quiet indignation. He listened, his eyes crinkling at the corners as a faint smile played on his lips. When I was finished, he simply shook his head. "Karen's an amateur," he said, his voice a low rumble. "We've had a few like her come and go. They all think they're running a small kingdom, but they're just pushing on a revolving door." He took a long, thoughtful sip from his coffee. "You can't win a fight by playing their game. They've already written the rules. The only way to win is to change them." The words hung in the air, a simple truth that shifted my entire perspective. He went on to recount a battle from 20 years ago, a fight over a communal garden that was won not with lawsuits, but by a homeowner who meticulously documented every cent of the HOA's budget and exposed their frivolous spending. It wasn't about winning a fight over the garden. It was about undermining the authority of the people who were picking the fight. I thanked him and walked away, the gears in my mind already turning. Henderson hadn't given me a legal solution. He'd given me a philosophical one. He had confirmed my own nascent plan. This isn't about the tree. It was about exposing the system itself. He had given me a new objective, and in doing so, he had handed me the ultimate weapon. After my talk with Henderson, the game changed. I wasn't fighting a tree dispute anymore. I was building a case for something much larger. I had the official notice in hand and the quiet encouragement of a man who'd seen this show before. My opponent, Karen, thought she was fighting a homeowner. She didn't realize she had just poked a methodical, detail-obsessed professional. My day job is to find the story in the numbers, to connect the dots that no one else sees. That's exactly what I did here, only instead of financial data, I was dealing with property records, meteorological reports, and a whole lot of dirt. I started with a deep dive into the public records. I found the original land survey from 1978. The one that showed the exact legal boundaries of every property on our block, including the precise location of my oak tree relative to Karen's foundation. It confirmed what I already knew. The tree was entirely on my side of the line. Its massive root system, a subterranean fortress that respected the law far more than the HOA president did. I went further. I pulled historical storm data for the last century, looking for patterns of high winds and rainfall. My theory was simple. The tree wasn't a danger. It was a stabilizer. Its roots were holding the very ground together, preventing the kind of soil erosion that could threaten the foundations of houses like Karen's on a slope like ours. The most compelling piece of evidence came from a geological survey of the area, a boring but crucial document that detailed the soil composition and drainage patterns. It confirmed that the ground beneath her house was a delicate mix of silt and clay, prone to shifting and instability, and that the only thing keeping it from giving way was the extensive root system of a mature tree. This wasn't just research. It was reconnaissance. Each piece of data was a bullet point in a larger, unwritten report. This was the work of a professional, not a petulant neighbor. I was gathering my weapons, piece by methodical piece, each one a silent threat to the empire Karen had built on flimsy rules and emotional demands. She had sent a notice. I was building a case. And I hadn't even started to fight. My investigation into the HOA's bylaws was a deep dive into the kind of mundane legal text that would put most people to sleep. But for me, it was a treasure map. I was looking for a single critical misstep, a flaw in the system. The bylaws were an endless series of clauses about lawn height and mailbox standards, a testament to the pettiness of suburban life. I was about to give up, ready to move on to my next line of attack, when I found it. It was buried deep in a dusty addendum, a forgotten piece of history from the original developer's charter. I had to squint to read the faded digital text, but the words were clear as day. Section 7.4.2. Environmental preservation and landmark designation. The clause stipulated that any tree designated a landmark by a certified arborist could not be removed without the unanimous consent of a 5-member environmental advisory panel. The kicker? The panel was not part of the standard HOA board. It was a separate entity, a shadow council with a single non-voting member who had the final say on all things related to heritage flora. I reread the clause 3 times. A thrill, sharp and cold, shot through me. It was like finding a secret tunnel in a castle you were told was impregnable. Karen had been operating under the assumption that the bylaws were her weapon, but I had just discovered a hidden one, a tactical nuke she didn't even know existed. This wasn't just a loophole. It was a check and balance, put in place decades ago to prevent exactly this kind of bureaucratic overreach. It gave a single, non-voting member of the community the power to veto the board's decision if a landmark tree was threatened. The victory wasn't just a feeling, it was a realization. This wasn't a shouting match. It was a chess game, and I had just found a move Karen hadn't even considered. The beige envelopes and angry confrontations were just distractions. The real battle was here, in the cold, precise language of a forgotten document. The board's entire argument was based on an incomplete understanding of their own rules. And I, the quiet guy up the hill, had just stumbled upon the truth. My secret weapon was not a protest or a petition. It was a single, obscure paragraph of text. With the discovery of the Environmental Advisory Panel clause, the fight became a surgical operation. I had found the weakness in the system. Now it was time to build a case so irrefutable that it would break their will before the first legal volley was even fired. This wasn't about proving my point. It was about making their argument impossible. My goal was to create a binder of evidence so dense, so meticulously detailed, that any rational person would see their side was lost before they even began. I started with the tree itself. I contacted a certified arborist, a professional with a PhD, and a reputation for being fiercely honest. I paid him for a full report, a document that didn't just certify the tree as a local landmark but also detailed its health, its age, and its undeniable contribution to the property's stability. Next, I commissioned a hydrological survey. I didn't just guess that the roots were holding the ground together. I got a professional to map the subsurface drainage and confirm it. The report came back with a stark conclusion. Without the oak's extensive root system, the slope, my house, and, more importantly, Karen's house we're built on would be highly susceptible to erosion during heavy rainfall. This wasn't just a defense of my property, it was a warning to hers. I dug up old historical photos of the neighborhood, some from local archives, showing the tree in its infancy, a testament to its long-standing presence. I added copies of the original land survey, the geological reports, and even a few pages from a city council meeting that discussed the importance of preserving ancient trees. Each piece of paper was a brick in a wall of evidence, a silent rebuke to Karen's vague, unsubstantiated claims. The binder grew thicker every day. It wasn't a collection of flimsy arguments. It was a dossier. I was no longer a homeowner fighting a bully. I was a professional building a case, a quiet, methodical process in the calm before the storm. I wasn't just preparing for a legal battle. I was preparing to expose the truth, one document at a time. The first move had been theirs. The final move would be mine, and it would be based on nothing but irrefutable facts. The monthly HOA meeting was held in the community clubhouse, a drab, beige room that perfectly matched Karen's aesthetic. She sat at the head of a long folding table, a smug expression on her face as she reviewed her notes. She looked up as I entered, her eyes narrowing in a quick flash of triumph. She likely assumed I was there to capitulate, to beg for a stay of execution for my tree. I walked to the back of the room, my now thick binder clutched in my hand. I didn't sit down. I stood, a silent and unblinking presence, waiting for her to acknowledge me. When she finally did, her voice dripped with condescension. "Mr. Jensen," she began, "I assume you are here to inform us of your compliance with the final notice." I opened my binder and placed it on the table in front of her. The thud of the thick stack of paper was loud in the quiet room. On the contrary, I stated calmly, "I am here to inform you that your final notice is without legal standing." A few people in the room shifted uncomfortably. Karen's smile vanished, replaced by a look of bewildered annoyance. "And on what grounds do you make that preposterous claim?" she shot back. I looked her dead in the eye. "On the grounds of your own bylaws." I then began to speak, not to her, but to the entire room, my voice calm and factual. I cited Section 7.4.2 of the original charter, the long-forgotten clause about the Environmental Advisory Panel. I explained, in a simple, straightforward manner, that their final notice was a violation of their own rules. "Do you have any legal basis to demand the removal of a certified landmark tree without the consent of a panel that, to my knowledge, doesn't exist?" I asked, a rhetorical question designed to highlight the absurdity of their position. I then pointed to the binder. Inside are certified reports, historical surveys, and geological data that not only prove the tree's protected status, but also its critical role in preventing soil erosion on this very hill. I watched her face, a mix of fury and confusion. She was out of her depth, drowning in facts and data. "This is an outrageous waste of our time," she declared, trying to regain control. "This is an HOA matter, not a legal one." "It's both," I said simply. "And you have made it so." She dismissed me, telling me to take my absurd claims to a lawyer, but it was too late. The seed of doubt was planted, not just in her mind, but in the minds of every neighbor watching the calm, professional man with the binder dismantle their queen's authority, one fact at a time. If my methodical presentation at the HOA meeting was a jab, Karen's next move was a wild haymaker swing. The day after the meeting, a new beige envelope arrived, thicker than the others and filled with a kind of impotent rage that almost felt physical. The title of the letter was no longer Notice of Non-Compliance. It was Immediate Demand for Action, written in a bold, aggressive font. The tone had shifted from bureaucratic condescension to outright bullying. She threatened fines, not the $50 a day from the first notice, but a staggering $500 a day to be retroactively applied from the date of the first letter. She also made a legally hollow but emotionally potent threat. If I didn't comply, the HOA would place a lien on my property, essentially turning my house into a hostage in our little game of suburban warfare. Her emotional outbursts were on full display, each new threat a sign of her unraveling. She was losing control, and the only way she knew how to fight was to escalate, to scream louder, to make bigger, emptier threats. Her plan was to intimidate me into submission. But I wasn't just observing her. I was documenting her. Each new letter, each new over-the-top demand was another piece of evidence for my case. I simply added it to my ever-growing binder, a new data point in the system I was building. This was exactly what I had hoped for. By refusing to play by her rules, I had forced her to create her own, and she was doing so with all the grace of a toddler in a tantrum. She was overplaying her hand, making claims that were legally tenuous and emotionally charged. She was providing me with the ammunition I needed. I didn't respond. I didn't argue. I didn't protest. I simply watched, the quiet guy up the hill, as she methodically dug her own grave, one angry beige envelope at a time. The irony was so rich I could taste it. She thought she was winning, but in reality, she was just providing me with a perfect paper trail of her own legal incompetence. They say no man is an island, and in suburban warfare, that's a professional liability. Karen thought she was fighting me alone, the quiet guy up the hill. She didn't realize that by targeting me, she had exposed a vulnerability in her own system, and a community of silent observers was starting to move. It began with small things. A wave from a neighbor I'd never spoken to before. A subtle nod as I got my mail. Then, it escalated. One evening, an older man from down the street, who I'd only ever seen mowing his lawn with military precision, came over with a covered plate. "Heard you're having some trouble with the HOA?" he said, handing me the plate of cookies. "Just wanted to say we're all rooting for you." The cookies were a pretext. He stayed and, in a hushed voice, recounted stories of Karen's past power plays. The family forced to remove their children's playhouse because it violated aesthetic standards. The retired couple fined for a birdbath. Karen wasn't enforcing rules. She was enforcing personal vendettas. He confirmed what my own research had suggested. She was a bully with a clipboard. The next day, a woman walking her dog paused by my oak tree. "It's beautiful," she said, her eyes fixed on the branches. "My kids love it." She then mentioned, in a conspiratorial whisper, that Karen had tried to make her replace her perfectly healthy rose bushes with something more uniform. She was just another casualty of Karen's suburban reign. The information I was gathering was no longer just from documents and bylaws. It was coming from the ground, from the people who had been living under Karen's rule for years. I was no longer seen as a solitary homeowner fighting a lost cause. I was becoming a symbol, the quiet guy up the hill who wasn't afraid to stand up to the bully. I hadn't asked for their help, and yet they were offering it. Each small act of defiance, each whispered story, was a piece of information that helped me build my case and solidified my position not as an aggressor, but as a liberator. I was a professional, fighting with facts, but I was gaining allies with every emotional misstep my enemy made. Karen's threats of liens and fines were legally flimsy, but they had a certain emotional weight. It was time to introduce a new variable into my equation, a professional opinion from someone with real legal authority. I tapped into my professional network, reaching out to a former colleague who had transitioned into property law. His name was Mark. I scheduled a virtual meeting, and as soon as we were connected, I could see the skepticism in his eyes. He had likely dealt with dozens of angry homeowners before, people who thought they had a case when all they had was a grudge. I didn't waste his time with emotional pleas. I simply held up my now massive binder to the camera. "Mark," I said, "I have a problem with my HOA, and I've compiled my case." I then methodically walked him through my documentation, the original bylaws, the forgotten Section 7.4.2, the Certified Arborist's Report, and the detailed hydrological survey. I showed him the series of increasingly unhinged beige envelopes, each one a testament to Karen's escalating rage. Mark's skepticism slowly melted away, replaced by a kind of professional awe. He asked to see the documents again, his eyes scanning the clauses and reports. "This is incredible," he said, shaking his head. "You've basically done a full discovery process on them without a single court order." He confirmed my findings. The HOA had overstepped their authority. Their threats were empty, and my case was ironclad. But then came the crucial piece of advice, the one that solidified my entire plan. "You can't sue them now," he explained. "They'll just fold, claim a mistake, and you'll get a small win. Your goal isn't just to win, it's to make them lose so badly they can't do this to anyone else." He advised me to simply wait, to be patient, to let Karen continue to overplay her hand until she made a fatal mistake, a public misstep so egregious that it would expose her not just as a bully, but as a legal liability to the entire HOA. My plan had been confirmed. The legal maneuver wasn't a lawsuit, it was a holding pattern. I was a professional, and I knew how to wait. My opponent was an amateur, a creature of pure, unbridled emotion. And emotion, as I knew, always leads to a mistake. My next move was to make no move at all. Following my refusal to back down, the neighborhood fell into a period of deceptive calm. The flow of beige envelopes ceased. Karen, having exhausted her flimsy legal threats, went quiet. The silence was almost more unsettling than the constant barrage of notices. It was the quiet of a predator waiting for its prey to make a mistake, to let its guard down. I knew this wasn't a retreat, it was a repositioning. She was a petty tyrant, a creature of pure ego. My calm defiance had flustered her, but it hadn't broken her. She was simply gathering her strength, looking for a new angle of attack, a more direct and personal one. This was the moment of maximum suspense, the calm before the coming storm. I used the lull not to relax but to prepare. I had already built my legal case, but now it was time to prepare for the inevitable. My research went from the abstract to the practical. I installed a series of motion-activated cameras around the perimeter of my property, a digital perimeter to protect against a physical breach. I set up alerts on my phone, tied to the cameras, and even a small, inconspicuous sensor at the base of the oak tree. My goal was simple: to be one step ahead of her, to have a complete and irrefutable record of her next move. I wasn't just waiting for her to make a mistake. I was creating a system that would capture it in real time. This was the final phase of my plan, the transition from defense to offense. I had all the data, all the legal counsel, and all the moral authority on my side. All I needed now was for her to step into the trap, and I knew, with a quiet certainty that settled deep in my bones, that she would. The quiet guy up the hill was no longer a ghost. I was a watchful guardian, a quiet sentinel, waiting for the first sign of movement in the stillness. I had a Chekhov's gun, and I was just waiting for the trigger to be pulled. She was a creature of impulse, and her silence was always a prelude to a reckless act. Karen, in her smug overconfidence, must have assumed the lull meant I had given up. She thought I'd been intimidated by her last flurry of threats, that the quiet guy up the hill had finally caved. She didn't realize the silence was my own doing, a deliberate pause in my meticulous plan. My patience was about to pay off. It was a Thursday. I was sitting in a meeting, 1,000 miles away, going over a series of spreadsheets when my phone buzzed with an alert. A security notification. My surveillance cameras, the ones I'd installed with surgical precision during the deceptive calm, had just been triggered. I didn't even have to look at the screen to know what was happening. My heart rate didn't spike. Instead, a cold sense of calm washed over me. The system was working. I excused myself from the meeting and pulled up the live feed. And there she was, Karen, in her beige cardigan, directing two men with a chainsaw and a truck. They were standing at the edge of my property line, preparing to cut down my tree. Her face was a mask of triumphant glee, a look of pure, unadulterated hubris. She was so sure of her victory, she wasn't even attempting to be discreet. She was making a mistake, a big one, a mistake I had been waiting for. My plan, which had been months in the making, was about to enter its final, dramatic phase. I made a series of rapid-fire calls. The first was to the lawyer, Mark, who I had briefed on the situation weeks before. The second was to a local news outlet, an investigative reporter I'd found during my research. The third was to the police, citing a clear case of trespassing and destruction of property. Within minutes, my quiet suburban street was about to become the site of a full-blown operation. A convoy was forming, a line of cars and trucks racing toward my home. They were coming, not to save my tree, but to document her fatal mistake. The climax had begun, and the look on her face when she saw what I had set in motion would be worth the price of admission alone. The drive home was a blur. I wasn't just in a car. I was at the center of a perfectly orchestrated operation. Behind me, a convoy of black sedans, each a piece of my meticulously crafted plan. First, the lawyer, Mark, a man who had gone from skeptical to a full-on believer. Next, the certified arborist, a professional with a PhD who was about to deliver a public lecture on environmental protection. And finally, the local news crew, their van a beacon of journalistic integrity, ready to capture the entire thing for the 6 o'clock news. The air was thick with a dramatic irony, so palpable I could almost taste it. Karen, in her beige cardigan, stood on my lawn like a conqueror, her smug smile a testament to her belief that she had finally won. She was pointing at the tree, giving instructions to the 2 contractors who were preparing their chainsaws. She didn't see my car pull up. She was too busy basking in the glow of her anticipated victory. I got out of the car, my movements calm and deliberate. The sound of the convoy of doors clicking shut behind me was a symphony of quiet authority. Karen finally turned, her smug smile faltering as she saw not just me, but the entourage behind me. The contractors, sensing the shift in the atmosphere, stopped what they were doing and looked at me, then at the sedans, then at the news van with the big camera mounted on top. Karen's voice, which had been so sharp and shrill, became a panic squeak. "What is this?" she demanded. I didn't answer her directly. I looked at the contractors, and in a calm, professional voice I said, "Gentlemen, you are currently trespassing on private property, and you are about to cause thousands of dollars in damages to a city-certified heritage landmark. This is a public matter now." The contractors looked at each other, their faces a mix of confusion and fear. I had changed the rules of the game, and they were caught in the crossfire. The arborist stepped forward, his credentials in hand. The news camera started rolling. And Karen stood there, speechless, the smug look on her face replaced by one of pure, unadulterated shock. Her victory had turned into a public spectacle, a humiliation she had created for herself. The climax was unfolding, and she was the star of a show she never meant to audition for. I didn't need to shout. I didn't need to yell. The sheer presence of the black sedans and the news camera was enough to bring the entire operation to a grinding halt. The contractors, 2 men in worn jeans and work boots, looked at me, then at Karen, their faces a mix of confusion and mounting panic. They knew a simple job had just become a public spectacle, a potential legal nightmare. On behalf of the homeowner, my lawyer, Mark, began, stepping forward with his own briefcase. "This is a formal cease and desist." He didn't need to say more. The contractors looked at each other, and then to Karen, who was sputtering. "You can't do this. I'm the HOA president." I simply held up my hand, silencing her. According to the HOA's own charter, Section 7.4.2, I stated calmly, my voice resonating with an authority that wasn't born of emotion, but of meticulous preparation. "This tree is a certified landmark. Any attempt to remove it without the consent of the Environmental Advisory Panel is a violation of both local ordinances and the HOA's own bylaws." I looked directly at the contractors. "Your company will be held liable for trespassing and any damages. The fines start at $5,000 and escalate from there." The mention of money, of real consequences, was the final nail in the coffin. The lead contractor, a man who just wanted to get paid, saw the writing on the wall. He nodded to his partner. "We're done here." They began to pack their equipment, their movements quick and purposeful. They were getting out before the situation got any worse. Karen stood there, a solitary figure on the edge of my lawn, her victory parade now a full-blown rout. The smug, triumphant expression she'd worn all morning was gone, replaced by a look of pure disbelief and humiliation. She had expected me to fold. She had expected to win. But in her overconfidence, She had walked straight into a trap I had been building for months. She was left alone, a bully without her muscle, a queen without her army. The contractors drove away, and the news camera continued to roll, capturing the silent, solitary figure of a woman who had just lost everything for the sake of a petty vendetta against an oak tree. Just as the last contractor truck pulled out of my driveway, leaving Karen standing in a state of mortified silence, the sky turned a bruised, angry purple. The air, which had been thick with tension, now felt heavy and electric. My hydrological survey, a document she had dismissed as a frivolous detail, had warned about the potential for flash flooding and soil instability during a 1-in-100-year storm event. It seemed that the universe, with a flair for dramatic irony, was about to deliver on that prediction. A low rumble of thunder echoed in the distance, a sound that seemed to mock the petty squabbles of the day. The wind, which had been a gentle breeze just moments before, began to howl, a mournful, rising shriek that tore at the leaves and sent them spiraling into the air. It was no longer a simple gust of wind. It was a character in my story, an uninvited guest arriving to settle an old score. The first drops of rain hit the pavement like an exclamation point, fat and heavy, quickly giving way to a relentless sheet of water that obscured everything. I watched from my porch as Karen, now soaking wet, finally retreated into her house, a solitary and defeated figure. The world outside was a symphony of chaos, a powerful, cinematic force of nature that cared nothing for HOA bylaws or legal threats. It was a beautiful thing to witness, the raw power of the storm washing away the last traces of human pettiness. The rain fell in sheets, the wind screamed through the valley, and I stood there, a quiet observer, watching the elements perform a final, dramatic act. I had planned for everything, but I hadn't planned for this. This wasn't a part of my system. It was an act of God, a force that was about to make Karen's problems my own. But for a brief moment, it was perfect. The universe had taken my side, and it was now speaking in a language I understood, cold, brutal, and utterly without emotion. The storm escalated from a dramatic display of nature's power into a full-blown assault. From the safety of my living room, I watched the wind whip the rain against the window panes. My oak tree, which had been the source of all this suburban conflict, was now a character in its own right, a silent protagonist enduring the rage of the elements. It swayed and groaned under the force of the wind, its ancient branches bending but not breaking. Karen had seen it as a weak link, a liability to be removed. I had seen it as a testament to resilience, a living system that had weathered centuries of change. She had underestimated it, just as she had underestimated me. A sudden, violent gust of wind, stronger than any before it, tore through the valley. I saw it hit the oak tree, its force a tangible thing. A loud crack echoed even over the sound of the howling wind. A massive, decades-old limb, thick as a man's torso, snapped clean off. It didn't fall to the ground. It was caught by the gale and sent spinning into the air like a piece of driftwood in a tempest. For a fleeting moment I felt a pang of something akin to sadness, a moment of concern for the old tree. But then, as the limb was torn away, I saw something else. The rest of the tree, its trunk massive and unyielding, remained standing. It had shed a part of itself to save the whole. It was a brutal, beautiful act of survival. Karen had wanted the whole thing gone. She had seen it as a threat, a problem to be solved with a chainsaw. She didn't understand its strength, its ability to adapt and endure. The storm was a test, and the tree was passing it. It was a final, ironic victory for the tree itself, a symbol of its power that no HOA notice could ever touch. I stood there, watching the storm, a grim sense of satisfaction settling in my gut. My tree was proving, with the force of a 1,000-year-old system, that it was not the weak link. The real problem, the true liability, was a lot closer to Karen's house. The universe has a dark, ironic sense of humor. I had been watching the storm from my window, marveling at the strength of my oak, a silent and unyielding titan. The rain was a solid sheet of water against the glass, and the wind was a symphony of destruction. A flash of lightning lit up the entire scene, so bright and so close that it felt like a cosmic camera flash. For a single frozen second, the world outside was a tableau, and in that second, I saw it. It wasn't my oak tree. It was a smaller, weaker tree in Karen's yard. A sickly-looking poplar she had planted years ago and never bothered to maintain. It had been twisted and bent by the storm, its shallow root system no match for the brutal winds. It swayed violently, a single, final moment of defiance before it gave up the fight entirely. A crack of thunder, so loud it rattled my bones, followed the flash. And then, a different kind of sound. Not the sound of a tree resisting, but the sound of something surrendering. The poplar gave way, its trunk snapping with a wet, splintering crash. It fell with a slow, agonizing certainty. It didn't just fall. It was directed, a precise and deliberate act of nature. It landed with a sickening crunch, the sound of wood and shingles and drywall giving way. It fell directly onto the roof of Karen's beige house, smashing through her attic and into her guest bedroom. The poetic justice of it was so perfect, so complete, that I almost couldn't believe it. My tree, the one she had obsessed over, the one she had tried to have destroyed, stood tall and defiant. The tree on her own property, the one she had neglected, the one she never even saw, had become her downfall. The flashing red and blue lights of first responders began to paint stripes across the street, their sirens wailing over the storm. The final act had begun, and it wasn't a product of my plan. It was an act of a higher, more dramatic power, a final piece of vindication that was far more satisfying than any legal victory could have ever been. The sirens were the final note in the storm's chaotic symphony. The flashing red and blue lights of fire trucks and police cars painted a stark, strobing tableau across my street. They were a vivid contrast to the dim, beige world Karen had tried to impose on us. I stood at my window, a silent, unblinking observer of the chaos. The rain had slowed to a drizzle, a final, somber act. The air was thick with the smell of wet earth and splintered wood. The scene unfolding on Karen's lawn was one of utter pandemonium. Firemen were trying to secure the broken limbs of the poplar, while police officers were taking statements. Karen was in the middle of it all, a disheveled figure soaked to the bone, her beige cardigan now a soggy, ruined mess. Her smug authority, her carefully constructed facade of control had completely evaporated. It was replaced by a look of frantic panic. She was arguing with a police officer, her hands waving wildly as she tried to explain what had happened. But there was no explanation, not one that made any sense. She had spent months trying to destroy my oak, a symbol of permanence and strength, only to be struck down by the very thing she had neglected, a weak, forgotten tree in her own yard. The irony was so profound it was almost comedic. The officer, a calm and methodical professional, was trying to get a clear story, but Karen was a torrent of emotional outbursts, a fountain of half-truths and furious accusations. She was a system in critical failure. I just watched. A quiet guy up the hill, a forensic accountant in a world of raw emotion, silently documenting the final, public collapse of a bully. I had spent months planning my defense, building a case out of data and logic, but in the end it was nature itself that delivered the final, crushing blow. The flashing lights were a final punctuation mark, a period at the end of a long, dramatic sentence. The game was over. I had won. But the true victor was a 150-year-old oak tree that hadn't even had to lift a branch to make its point. The aftermath of the storm was a quiet, almost surreal kind of chaos. The insurance adjuster arrived the next day, a grim-faced man in a suit who looked like he'd seen it all. He walked up my driveway and, with a kind of weary resignation, asked if I had any information on the incident. He had a clipboard and a camera, and a look that said he was just here to process the claim and go home. I didn't have to offer him my binder. He had already seen it. "I'm reviewing the HOA's file," he said, his voice flat. "And I've got to say, this is the most meticulous documentation I've ever seen. The arborist report, the hydrological survey, even the historical photos. It's all in there." He explained that a significant part of their investigation revolved around whether the tree that fell was the primary cause of damage, or if the property was compromised by an existing threat. The irony, so rich it was almost sickening, was that Karen's attempt to remove my tree had become the key piece of evidence against her. My binder, which was meant to protect me from her, was now being used by her own insurance company to deny her claim. They were arguing that her reckless behavior, the frivolous attempt to remove a certified landmark tree, was a contributing factor to the storm damage. They cited my documents as proof that she was acting against expert advice and was aware of the property's geological instability. Her attempt to create a problem for me had, in a beautiful twist of fate, created a legal and financial catastrophe for herself. The adjuster, in a rare moment of candor, looked me dead in the eye. "She tried to get a contractor to cut down your tree," he said. "The news crew and police report confirmed it. Her claim is as good as denied. It's a textbook case of gross negligence." The irony was the final, brutal punctuation mark on the whole affair. I hadn't even had to fight her. I had just presented my case, and the universe, in its own methodical way, had done the rest. The news of the insurance claim denial spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. A final, lethal piece of gossip that brought Karen's suburban reign to its knees. The emergency HOA meeting was called for a Friday night. The air in the beige community room was no longer thick with condescension. It was heavy with a palpable sense of betrayal and panic. The other board members, a group of unremarkable people who had always cowered in Karen's shadow, now looked at her with suspicion and resentment. She was a liability, a public relations nightmare, and their only option was to cut their losses. Karen, desperate and exposed, tried to go on the offensive. She turned to me, her voice shrill with a final desperate burst of fury. "He's the one who started this," she screamed, pointing an accusing finger. "He refused to remove his tree. This is all his fault." Her attempt to shift the blame was pathetic. It was a final, wild swing from a fighter who had already been knocked out. A new voice, a quiet one I'd never heard before, came from a woman at the end of the table. "He provided us with reports," she said, her voice steady. "We ignored them. He warned us about the property's instability." Another board member, a man who had been a silent accomplice to her every whim, spoke up. "And you threatened to put a lien on his property. Do you know how much that's going to cost us in legal fees?" The dam had broken. The system she had so carefully controlled was now turning on her, using her own tactics against her. The anger in the room was no longer directed at me. It was directed at the person who had brought this entire mess down on them. They were not fighting a tree anymore. They were fighting for their own homes, their own reputations, their own financial stability. A motion was made to remove Karen as president, effective immediately. It was seconded, and then passed with a unanimous silent vote. Her reign of terror, built on a foundation of beige envelopes and flimsy threats, was officially over. She stood there, a solitary figure in a room full of people who had just publicly humiliated her. Her reign was over, and she had nobody to blame but herself. The next evening I sat in my living room and watched the news. The local broadcast opened with a dramatic shot of Karen's house, a massive hole in her roof, visible even on the low-resolution video. The reporter's voice was full of breathless drama, describing the unprecedented storm damage and the subsequent HOA controversy. Then the screen cut to a clip of me. I was standing on my porch, my oak tree looming majestically behind me. The camera lingered on it for a moment, a silent, powerful testament to its own resilience. The reporter asked me a question about the dispute, and I answered not as a bitter neighbor but as a professional. I held up my binder, the same one that had been the subject of so much contention. "This isn't a personal issue," I said calmly. "This is about due process and property rights." I explained how I had simply responded to the HOA's demands by meticulously documenting the facts. I spoke about the hydrological survey, the arborist's report, and the forgotten charter clause. I used phrases like legal vulnerability and gross negligence. I was a narrator of my own story, and my narrative was based on irrefutable evidence. I was not portrayed as a vindictive neighbor. I was a reasonable man who had been pushed too far, a professional who had used his skills to defend his home. The juxtaposition was perfect. The camera cut back to Karen, who was shown arguing with the police in the rain, her face a mask of frantic rage. The contrast between my calm, factual delivery and her emotional outburst was all the public needed to see. The news story didn't just report on the events. It framed them in a way that left no room for doubt. It was the final, public confirmation of what I had known all along. This was never a fight I could lose. I had simply waited for the system to expose its own flaws, and then I had meticulously documented the results for the entire world to see. The storm passed, the news vans departed, the flashing red and blue lights were gone, and with them, the chaos. A new kind of quiet settled over the neighborhood, a quiet born not of fear, but of respect. The neighborhood was forever changed. The bully had been exposed, her reign of terror brought to a definitive and public end. The oak tree stood on my lawn, a silent, majestic monument to the entire affair. It had lost a limb, a scar it would carry forever, but it had survived. It had been tested and had passed, its roots still deep and unyielding, a symbol of permanence in a world of petty, temporary conflicts. I was no longer just the quiet guy up the hill. I was the quiet hero who had stood up to a bully and won. Not with threats or emotion, but with cold, hard facts. My neighbors now offered me a different kind of wave, a genuine one that carried the weight of a shared secret. I had been their ghost. Now I was their protector, the silent sentinel they could count on to watch over the system. A few weeks later, a familiar sight appeared in my mailbox, a beige envelope. My heart didn't race with a sense of dread or anger. Instead, a small, knowing smile played on my lips. I opened it. It wasn't laminated. It wasn't filled with threats. It was a formal letter of apology from the new HOA board, their words carefully chosen and legally vetted. They apologized for the unfortunate misunderstanding and assured me that they were working to revise their bylaws to prevent such a thing from happening again. They offered to pay for a full arborist report on my tree, a final, beautiful act of submission. The war was over. I had won. But the true victory wasn't the apology or the change in the board. It was the quiet knowledge that I had fought a good fight, not for the sake of revenge, but for the sake of justice. As the neighborhood slowly returned to a state of normalcy, a new kind of quiet settled over my house. It was a peaceful, earned silence, the kind that follows a long and arduous battle. I found myself sitting on my porch, watching the oak tree, its branches now a familiar, comforting silhouette against the evening sky. I reflected on the entire ordeal not with a sense of vindictiveness but with a cool, professional detachment. It was a case study in human behavior, a perfect illustration of a simple truth. Petty power is the most dangerous kind. Karen hadn't been a monster. She was just a small person with a little bit of authority, and she had used it to enforce her own small-minded whims. Her mistake was in believing that emotion and volume could win a fight against patience and strategy. She thought she was fighting a neighbor. She was actually fighting a system. She came at me with anger and bluster. I came at her with binders and bylaws. I didn't have to break the system. I just had to understand it better than she did. I didn't fight her. I let her fight herself, and she was far more effective at her own destruction than I ever could have been. The triumph wasn't in seeing her house destroyed. The triumph was in the deep, quiet satisfaction of knowing that I had handled the situation with an authority and a grace that she could never comprehend. The moral of the story wasn't about revenge. It was about righteous justice. It was about the triumph of strategy over emotional outbursts, of data over drama. I had learned that the most powerful weapon you can wield is not an angry retort, but a stack of meticulously compiled facts. It's a quiet kind of victory, one that doesn't come with flashing lights or dramatic speeches. It comes with the satisfaction of knowing that you played a long game and won, not because of luck, but because of a methodical, unyielding plan. A new calm settled over the neighborhood. The storm damage was repaired, the insurance claim was settled, and the hole in Karen's roof was patched. My world, once consumed by the petty drama of a beige envelope, had returned to a state of equilibrium. I stood at my window, a quiet observer once again, looking out at the world I had so methodically defended. The street, once painted with the flashing lights of chaos, was now a portrait of serene domesticity. My gaze settled on the oak tree. It stood tall, a testament to resilience and an unspoken promise of permanence. It had lost a limb, a scar it would carry forever, but it had survived, a silent hero in a story of its own making. My role in all of it felt distant, almost academic. I was still the quiet guy up the hill, the ghost they never saw until they had a problem they couldn't solve. But now, when my neighbors saw me, there was a new look in their eyes. It wasn't just recognition, it was respect. I hadn't sought their admiration, but it was a satisfying byproduct of my righteous victory. My triumph wasn't loud or explosive, it was quiet and methodical. I didn't win with anger or emotional outbursts. I won with a binder, a spreadsheet, and a deep understanding of the system I was fighting. The story of the oak tree was a testament to the enduring power of a professional approach. It was a victory for every person who has ever been underestimated, every quiet professional who has ever been pushed too far. I had been tested, and my system had worked. The world could be chaotic, people could be irrational, but I knew that with enough patience and a single well-placed fact, you could right a wrong. I closed the curtains, a peaceful sense of finality settling over me. My work was done. The quiet guy up the hill was back to his quiet life, but now he was a little bit wiser, a little more confident, and ready for whatever the next chapter might bring.